Okay, it's 6:05. A good moment to start. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's CSSGJ seminar. My name is Andreas Bieler. I'm one of the co-directors of the center, and it's my pleasure to host this evening's talk. And we have with us tonight Christin Bernhold and Benjamin Selwyn, and they will launch their book, Capitalist Value Chains. You can already see the cover on the screen in front of you. Labor Exploitation, Nature, Geopolitics. Now, Christin Bernhold is professor at the University of Hamburg, and prior to this jointly authored book, she has also published a book in 2022 called Global Value Chains and Uneven Development, Corporate Strategies and Class Dynamics in Argentinian Agribusiness. And one can see how that's in a way a stage towards this joint book then also with Ben Selwyn. Ben Selwyn, in turn, has been a professor for several years now at Sussex University in Brighton, and his prior publications, amongst many articles, include the books Workers, State and Development in Brazil, Powers of Labor, Chains of Value, published in 2012. Here too one can see already the first stages towards this jointly authored book. In 2014, he published The Global Development Crisis, and in 2017, The Struggle for Development. So I'm very pleased to be the chair this evening and host this particular sessions. It's great to have so highly prestigious authors with us this evening. And we proceed in the usual manner. Ben and Christine will first present for about 35 to 40 minutes, leaving us with another similar amount of time for question, answers, and debate. So please, Ben, is it you who starts us off?
Yeah.
Over to you. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Andreas. And thanks for the invitation. Thanks to Oliver for setting this all up. And thanks to Andreas also for the very thoughtful review of our book in the LSE Review of Books. A very stimulating review, which is exactly how a review should be. So I'll get straight to the point. Our book is called Capitalist Value Chains, Labor Exploitation, Nature Destruction, Geopolitics. Everything about the cover of the book and about the title of the book is designed to demystify and contradict the mainstream GVC, Global Value Chain approach, which is embodied by the World Bank in its World Bank Development Report, by people like Gary Gareffi, and a whole swathe, literally thousands of academics and practitioners around the world who advocate GVCs for development, global value chains for development. They argue that upgrading inclusion in GVCs is the best way to foster development. Our book is a full-fronted critique of that, a demystification of that. We argue that global value chains are capitalist value chains, and that these CVCs, these capitalist value chains, are generalized systems of appropriation, labor exploitation, and the expropriation of nature, the extraction and destruction of nature. And these work in tandem, backed up by imperialist geopolitics and intra-struggles between major powers. So next page, Christin. Sorry, I just need to ask Christin to do this because she's got control. So just to start off with the basics. When we're talking about global value chains or global production networks or global supply chains, all of those really mean the same thing. We're talking about the fragmentation of production across borders. Your iPhone, your mobile, your laptop, a huge array of products, electronic vehicles, etc., are produced not in one country, as perhaps Ford Motors were in around 100 years ago, but in many countries. And it's not just that they are produced in many countries, they are governed by lead firms. So the big firms, Walmart, Amazon, Apple, Ford, Volkswagen, control, manage their chains. Okay, next page, please, Christin. And this leads up to around 70% of international trade flows through GVCs. And just to start by saying, I mean, our book is a full-fronted critique of Gorefi and the World Bank, but we don't owe the World Bank anything at all. We find them completely ideological, and basically everything they say, if you take the opposite perspective, you're closer to the truth. Gary Gorefi, on the other hand, we do owe a debt of gratitude. He came up. I mean, he came up with a GVC approach and the GCC before that, global commodity chain approach. He adapted it from world systems approach. He made it usable. We were able to deploy it in our research, and many people have done so, both critically and from a mainstream perspective, to great effect. And it has one really important thing that it does, Gorefi's GVC approach, is it punches the myth of the free market, so-called, which was prevalent in the 1990s and 2000s. Remember Thatcher, there is no alternative. Following 1991, the free market dominated. And Gorefi's approach really showed that trade was not free. It wasn't even managed. It was driven by lead firms controlling things that happen in nominally independent supplier firms. What's being produced, how it's being produced, how much the lead firm pays for it, and so on. And so what the GVC approach does, which Gorefi made such a big contribution to doing, is enabling a close-up micro analysis of the developmental effects of globalization. And that is a very valuable contribution. So we respect Gorefi enormously for that. Next page, please, Christin. But we also disagree very much, profoundly with him, actually. We see Gorefi as propounding a new form of modernization theory embodied within GVC approach. It's modernization theory minus the methodological nationalism of Rostow, transformed into the kind of firm centrism of the GVC approach, which I'll go on to explain in a moment. Now, I'm not going to go through each of the chapters, but each of these chapters are standalone in the sense that you can read them and you can get something important in terms of a critique and an alternative to the mainstream GVC approach from each chapter. The book adds up to more than the sum of its parts, as I'll try and explain in this contribution. Next page, please, Christin. Okay, so the main argument for the GVC mainstream is that upgrading leads to development. You've got product, process, function, chain upgrading, you've got entering new markets. So in my own research, for example, on grape production in Northeast Brazil, product upgrading would be moving from, say, seeded to seedless grapes. Process upgrading would be producing grapes more effectively, making workers work more effectively. Function upgrading would be perhaps taking on the branding of the grapes. Chain upgrading would be moving into a different chain altogether. And market upgrading would be entering into a new market, say from the top-end Brazilian market to, say, the European market to, say, the UK market, which at the time is paying the most. And as Gorefi and his colleagues say, the upgrading approach represents a new paradigm of development. If he was saying it represents a new paradigm of uneven development, we probably would not have written this book. But he's saying it represents a new paradigm of development. As the World Bank says, all countries can benefit from upgrading into global value chains. And it is true, absolutely. There are many, hundreds, if not thousands of examples of successful upgrading. Christin's work is one of them. My work is one of them. Our co-author, Dara Layden, who contributed to two of the chapters, also focused on electronics upgrading in Thailand. There are many examples of successful upgrading. But the point is, and this is where we differ from Gorefi and from the World Bank fundamentally, is that these cases are not generalizable. It does not add up to a new paradigm of development. It adds up to a new paradigm of uneven development, exploitation, and nature destruction. Next page, please, Christin. So obviously, you would expect us, if you know our work and if you're familiar with the contents of this seminar series, to be focusing on questions of labour. And what we see is that the system of global value chains or capitalist value chains rests upon a huge increase in the global labouring class, especially in China, the great doubling, as some people refer to it, a massive increase in the massive surplus value that is created through heightened exploitation of labour south and north. That's an important point. It's not just in the global south that workers are increasingly exploited through global value chains. It's in the global north too. And this is where our book differs from some other critical approaches, which we find very useful, important to say. We will be speaking about nature destruction in some more detail. Christin will talk about that. Another point is that GVCs are not new paradigms of development. They are new paradigms of uneven development. They generate new rounds of uneven development. Uneven development is intrinsic to capitalism. Global value chains or capitalist value chains are outgrowths of and contributors to the reproduction of capitalism on a greater scale. Bigger working class, more capital, a greater class relational dynamic on a world scale than ever before. More workers, more capital. But it generates uneven development. If you look at Vietnam in the 1990s, became a huge coffee exporter, benefiting Vietnamese producers. This had a detrimental effect in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Central and Latin America and South America, where less competitive producers were forced out of the markets. Farms were abandoned, workers were made unemployed, incomes fell. Success for one was devastation for another. If you look more contemporarily, you've seen that China has become the industrial center of the world in many ways, which is very interesting. Analytically, has great political implications too, as we'll see. But it also means that you've had reprimarization in places like Brazil and Argentina, where these industries that had sprung up from the 1930s onwards under import substitution industrialization. And I should note, I'm no fan of ISI. We are not hearkening back to a golden era of industrial development under capitalism. We're not saying that. What we are saying is that industrial structure that was built up between the 1930s and the 1980s was undermined fundamentally by the hyper-competitiveness of China and East Asia. Of course, helped along by the structural adjustment programs taking place, imposed by the IMF and World Bank. So the point is, GVCs generate uneven development. Next slide, please, Christin. One of the key points we make is that the expansion of the system of capitalist value chains is based upon the great doubling, a huge increase in the global working class, and a huge increase of numbers of workers who are not paid a living wage. When you look at Chinese manufacturing, when you look at, say, Cambodian manufacturing, when you look at manufacturing in Eastern and Central Europe, when you look at manufacturing in the United Kingdom, in certain sections, you find workers who are paid poverty wages. What do we mean by poverty wages? Obviously, we don't accept the World Bank's definition of poverty, which is completely ideological and completely useless for telling you whether someone could survive just above the poverty line that the World Bank stipulates, which was historically $1 a day, and now it's around $2 something, and they've got several poverty lines, and you can read the book for more detail there. These poverty lines are useless. What we use, and we take Marx's point that the analysis of poverty, understanding poverty, there is a moral element. What is morally appropriate for workers to be living at that kind of standard? That's the question. That's the question that Marx asked. That's what we're asking. So we use an idea of a living wage, and we say, are workers employed in global value chains able to earn a living wage within a given 48 hours of work per week? That's the ILO definition of what is decent work. We don't use that because we are pro-ILO in the sense of saying they have the answers. We use that as an imminent critique of the World Bank's miserable poverty line, which is designed to show that poverty is much less than what it really is, designed to boost them as the guardians of global capitalism. And what we find is that in one case after another, you have immiserating growth regimes. You have enormous economic growth based upon workers working 60, 70, 80, 90 hours a week in order to make do, because their basic wages in 48 hours a week are not enough to enable them to survive. At the same time, we make the point that these global value chains are novel forms of exploitation because they're combining what Marx called absolute surplus value, that is extending the working day, with relative surplus value, which is introducing new machinery, new technologies, new management systems to fill up every single pore of the working day and intensify production to the maximum. So you have this particular combination that exists within global value chains that raises the rate of exploitation of labour on a world scale. And this is quite particular to these GVCs. So you have a combination of relative and absolute surplus value appropriation, leading in many cases to questions or dynamics of immiserating growth regimes. Christin, next page. I think I've mentioned this already. We can go past that one. And what we bring here is the theory that underpins our approach is that of international class relations. On one hand, you have methodological nationalism. In the worst case scenario, that's Rostow and modernization theory, but you've also got methodological nationalism within a whole swathe of very useful and excellent Marxist work. The transition debate, for example, much of that was based upon comparing different countries, England versus, say, France or Germany in the transition to capitalism. That's methodological nationalism. That's one perspective which we don't use. Another perspective is methodological globalism, where we see the global system as the core dynamic and driver of capitalist development. Our perspective is international class relations, which is a dialectical approach to saying the following, that states play a major role in the class formation of their capitalists and their workers, in inverted commas. But of course, it is not the case that these states exist in isolation from other states. They exist in interaction, integrated through an imperialist chain with them, with the more powerful states having a greater say or greater impact and influence upon the lesser powerful states in class formation. Right, so you can see that the United States has had a major impact in terms of class formation in China. So when we look at Silicon Valley and the great, marvelous tech bros who destroyed the earth and present themselves as neo-Schumpeterian innovators, Übermensch, and so on, because of course Schumpeter drew on Nietzsche, and he saw innovators as these Übermensch. And this is how the entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley would like themselves to be seen. Well, that's not the case. They've been funded heavily by the US government, appropriated a huge amount of free knowledge from US universities and academics, but fundamentally they've got where they are because they have benefited from the expansion of the Chinese working class, the decimation of the old Chinese working class, the establishment of a new 250 million migrant labor force from the rural to the urban areas, and it's the immiserating growth regimes in China that produces the huge amount of wealth that companies like Apple benefit from. And so what you've had is the class polarization on an international scale. Okay, next slide, please. So mainstream theory gets it wrong because it has this very limited conception of Schumpeterian innovation, where they stress the innovation, the upgrading, but they've cancelled out what Schumpeter also talked about, which was destruction, creative destruction. They miss destruction. And for us, the destruction is the exploitation, natural and environmental destruction, and the uneven development that goes along with it. As I mentioned, they transcend methodological nationalism in one way, but they replace it with a firm centrism or methodological singularism, where they look at the relationship between firms specifically, without placing those relationships between firms in their broader socioeconomic context, which is a capital-labor relation mediated through international class relations and the imperialist chain. They've got no class relations, they've got no theory of value, even though their title, Global Value Chains, suggests that they do. What they do have is a theory of value capture, not of value production. Okay, I've got 1.5 minutes left. Last slide. So what we do, we start from class analysis. We don't do what a lot of academics do and say, we're going to bring this back in. Well, if it's excluded in the first place, there's something wrong with the social scientific approach. We start from an integrated approach where class is right at the heart of what we understand, because class is where value is produced and is then distributed. So class is at the core. We have international class relations, and these class relations work through nature, which is a really important point, because a lot of analysis either ignores nature or says class and nature. We understand class working through nature, and the exploitation of labor is mediated through the process of the appropriation of nature, and vice versa. And so finally, we argue for thinking beyond. I think I've got one more slide after this. Our point really is to demystify global value chains and provide an alternative framework. And I'll just, the last slide is right at the end. Okay, I forgot about that. I'll hand right over to Christin for the next bit. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks, Ben, and thanks everyone for being here, and Andreas for organizing this. I do my very best to speak in a well enough English, and I'm going to dive a little bit more into two of the chapters we wrote, obviously not all of them. Ben has already talked about class differentiation, a little bit about class relational dynamics, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of geopolitics. And if you look at recent GPN, GVC contributions, it seems like people seem to assume that geopolitics are back after the corona pandemic, but also with the increased rivalry and increased geopolitics and geopolitical nationalism, for instance, by the Trumpian US government. And while we agree that where the US imperialism is trying to defend its position at the top of the imperialist chain, it's getting more aggressive. We don't think that geopolitics ever really were absent from co-building or creating the politics in which GVCs, or as we call it, CVCs, could develop. And this has to do historically with wars against peripheral countries for resources used in CVCs. It has to do with CIA-backed civic military coups to create a neoliberal structure adjustment for CVC politics. But it also has to do with what we say here, how geopolitics were key to establishing core technologies. For instance, following the Second World War, the US Pentagon began working with the Atomic Agency Commission and NASA to develop technologies such as ICT, computers, lasers, biotechnology, and so on. And the key accelerator of this development was the so-called Cold War against the Soviet Union. And in 1958, the federal government founded DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, and it supported the research that led to the development of the internet, among other things, and continues to support cutting-edge research in electronics. And we collect a lot of examples showing that geopolitics were never gone. They've always been part and parcel of CVC development. And what we then do is we use the notion of international class relations and also of the imperialist chain to try to understand a little bit better why US-China rivalry has become, from the US side, more and more aggressive. And we say that within the imperialist chain, at the top of that chain, in countries that are the leaders, above all the US as the leading imperialist state, in these states, class formation entails the capacity to control key means of production, which are as well key means of exploitation in and through CVCs. And for a long time, the internationalization of class relations that led to China becoming, first of all, the work bank of the world, was very much in the interest of US firms, but also in the interest of US imperialism, in the sense that it was based on China delivering cheap goods to the US. And as long as Chinese firms, through a very strategic project, were not yet in the position to really become competitive in medium and high-tech chain links, this was not something where the US would kind of be aggressive about. But just when Chinese companies became capable of really competing with highly monopolized US firms in the chain links of medium and high-tech production, but later also development, this is the minute the US rivalry against China took a more aggressive side. And the other chapter I want to dive into a little bit is about CVCs and nature destruction. Here again, we start with a critique of what the mainstream in the GVC community does, where as in other eco-modernization examples, the mainstream does recognize socio-ecological crisis and that something has to be done against it. But they come up with the notion of environmental upgrading, which is another add-on after social upgrading and industrial upgrading. And DiMarchi and others have defined environmental upgrading as any change that results in the reduction of the firm's ecological footprint or when the net gains in environmental improvements are more than the losses. And there are contributions that are very affirmative of lead firm power, and they pose that lead firms are the ones capable of technological innovation that could lead to greened GVCs. But there are also contributions that are more critical of lead firm power that point to the limits of environmental upgrading. Stefano Ponte, for instance, has done some excellent work on how firms like IKEA ecologically upgrade, but this is connected to a supplier squeeze, where they not only appropriate part of the profit produced elsewhere in the chain, but also some of the environmental damage is kind of pushed to other parts of the chain. We, however, have argued in that chapter that these contributions, to some degree, lack a class relational understanding of how this is not only an issue of power relations, but the structural destruction of nature is something that can only be understood if you understand capitalist production and circulation and the role of nature and nature destruction in it. Consistent with the book, we have first asked ourselves, how is this a class relational issue? And we have worked with works from people like Christian Stach, Hans Rackwitz, John Bellamy Foster, Paul Burkett, and others to show how in every society there's also always a metabolism with nature. We need to work, we need to use nature to produce food and so on and so forth. But under capitalism, the social labor mediating the metabolism is shaped according to the imperatives of capital accumulation, which leads, as I will show in a minute, to a systemic abstraction from the qualities of nature. And we have used this work to also show how exploitation of workers and the exploitation or appropriation of nature are part of the very same process. This does not mean that it's the same. Obviously, the exploitation of double free workers is a particular capitalist relation, but the non-human nature under capitalism, unlike labor, is really private property. This is a relation of direct appropriation and direct appropriation as means of production. Foster and Paul Burkett have very nicely analyzed how this leads to a socio-ecological antagonism of capital on the one hand and both labor and nature on the other, or also Foster's work on Marx's notion of the metabolic rift. So as I told you already, we have shown how this leads to a systemic abstraction from the qualities and also the reproductive needs of non-human nature. And this is bound on the one hand to the capitalist property relations and also obviously to capitalist growth. But for us, it was very important to think about how this is a qualitative, not just a quantitative process. For instance, if you look in the meat industry, which serves as an example for our chapter, you can very impressively analyze how the form of nature appropriation already starts at the level of the individual animal body that is not capable of reproduce itself. For instance, with chickens that are raised in a way that they are so heavy that they can't even support their own weights. This leads to destruction of nature at multiple scales, ranging, as I just said, from the treatment of individual animal bodies, but to global environmental degradation, biodiversity loss, climate change, and so on and so forth. And obviously, capital accumulation and as a consequence, growth plays an immense role in this. And while capital's pursuit of growth is boundless, nature's capacity to cope with the effects of it are not. And obviously, this is not only true at the level of the individual animal, for instance, but for nature, non-human nature in total. We are not saying, again, like in industrial upgrading, that it is not possible for individual lead firms, for instance, to create technologies that are less damaging, that produce less CO2 equivalent emissions, and so on and so forth. But we relate to the notion, we relate to Jevons paradox to show how efficiency gains under capitalism are systematically used to increase accumulation, to reinvest, to produce more and more, rather than do the opposite. And here again, we use the example of the feed meat complex to show, for instance, how even though biotechnology development and new breeds and new feeding methods have led to a decrease in CO2 equivalent emissions per kilogram of meat, but at the same time, the meat industry globally is growing so much that total CO2 equivalent emissions will grow nevertheless in the next couple of years. And obviously CVCs have a huge accelerating effects on this. This is due to the immense expansion of infrastructure, roads, railways, air and seaports, and so on and so forth, used for the transports of parts and components that are shipped around the globe, but also enhanced intangible commodities like services and knowledge deployed through computers and software, which use a huge amount of energy. And a lot of works by other critical researchers have shown how CVCs actually have led to a growing use of non-human nature and of obviously growing waste sinks as part and parcel of the expansion of CVCs. And even though since the early 1990s with the Rio conference latest, everyone knows that sustainability should be a big issue. You see in this slide that since the 1990s, the use of coal, oil, and natural gas have grown immensely, and we argue that CVCs have played a big part in this. Obviously, again, there's a differentiation among different firms in different countries as well. Different firms of different sizes, but also different political economies contribute to metabolic growth on varying extents. Historically, the vast amount of CO2 equivalent emissions obviously comes from the imperialist centers. But nevertheless, the history of CVCs is a history of enterprises appropriating nature at ever increasing scale and pace, where the results of this are global results. And also growth in various chain links, as we show again with the example of the meat feed value chains, are linked. For instance, the growth in meat has been dependent on the growth of feed production, for instance, soybeans in Argentina or Brazil, where nature destruction was created accordingly. And the same is happening with electric cars and lithium, for instance, where at the moment ecological modernization in the automobile industry means the production of electric cars and not the production of more kind of democratized ways of public transport. And while in the countries where these electric cars are bought, CO2 equivalent emissions decrease, this is also connected to vast nature destruction in the production of lithium in countries like Chile or Argentina, for instance. I've already talked about the Jevons paradox. I've already talked a little bit about how we've used this to speak about the feed meat value chains. I can just invite you to read the book if you want to look into more of these examples, and go over to Ben again for the last slide.
Thanks, Christin. So this book is fundamentally a demystification of the GVC, the mainstream GVC approach. Our endeavor in writing this was to show what's wrong with it, and therefore to open up a conversation about what needs to replace it. We did think about writing a chapter about what comes next, what is to be done, but we thought we'd leave that for a later time, because otherwise we'd probably never finish the book. A lot of people, when they hear us speak, they agree with quite a lot of what we say. Obviously, we haven't been presenting at the World Bank or economists or anything like that, but good people like you generally tend to agree with this critique. But a lot of people do say, well, what is the policy? You know, what are the policy implications? And policy often is a problematic notion because it assumes an existing structure and transformations, not of that structure, but around it, tweaks, a bit like what Keir Starmer is doing. And so our whole point about thinking about what is to be done is to say GVCs, CVCs, capitalism are the problem. Upgrading solutions are worse than the problems they purport to solve. Industrial, economic, social, environmental upgrading, it all leads to more global value chains, more energy use, more exploitation. We haven't talked in this presentation about labour that much in terms of labour's ability to disrupt global value chains, but we do have a whole chapter in it, which was written primarily by Dara Layden, and I think it's an excellent chapter, and he shows all of the different ways and huge number of examples in which workers do have and don't have powers to transform global value chains. But just to give one example, as we were finishing the book in the autumn of 2024, there's a big strike in the United States on the West Coast, disrupting the ports. After several days, dock workers won massive pay rises of around 60% because of their structural power to operate in choke points and to disrupt global value chains. So there is power there, but we also point out that that cannot be generalized either. So it's not an easy solution, but we do have a number of areas we can mobilize around, and these include, we've written about this differently, about things like shifting away from meat feed to plant-based food systems, using digital technology where we prioritize sufficiency rather than efficiency, because efficiency under capitalism is never ending, whereas sufficiency can be politically determined. But at the end of the day, we are arguing that we need to confront GVCs, CVCs, confront capitalism. We think that reforms are necessary, but unlike reformists who argue for reforms within capitalism, our reforms are designed to erode, to encroach upon, and to ultimately overcome capitalism itself. And I'll finish there. Thanks very much.
And maybe just one last word on the revolutionary geopolitics. This is the notion we borrowed by Rosa Luxemburg, who has argued very nicely, to my belief, that socioeconomic struggles in the here and now, class struggles from below, can and should be for real-time improvements, but they should be fought in a way that they don't end up stabilizing capitalism, but that they kind of create the pathway for a bigger political class struggle for socialism.
Fantastic. Many thanks. What a good way to end the presentation with, by referring to Rosa Luxemburg. So excellent presentation, fantastic overview of the book. I think that gives a very good impression of the contents, what the book is. I can highly recommend it to you for reading. But for now, we also still have 35-40 minutes during which we can ask questions, we can debate. So please, if you want to raise an issue, if you could indicate that electronically by raising your hand. Christine, perhaps if we stop with the PowerPoint presentation, then we get more easily together and we can see everyone on the screen in front of us. Fantastic. So who is going to kick us off with the first question? Please indicate. Alternatively, if you don't want to indicate and talk, you can also put your question in the chat, of course, and I'm going to read it out and for you. Yes, Andrea, over to you.
Hi, that's really a really great presentation, honestly. I'm really now I do want to read the book, so that I guess that was accomplished. I have a question on the side of the relation between imperialism and global value chains, in the sense that so of course I think it's even quite obvious to state it right now, but of course, global value chains are being impacted by the inter-imperialist confrontations, if not war, that we're seeing right now. But my question is the other way around, right? So it would be uh, how have global value chains shaped that confrontation? And for example, how have and for the sake of looking at international relations in a dialectical way, how have global value chains um, sort of promoted the surge of certain powers that now are disputing U.S. hegemony, right? So I wanted to know if you could expand a little bit on rather than on how global value chains are being impacted by imperialism, how the geography of imperialism has been affected by how global value chains um, have been configured historically, right? Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Andrea. Ben, Christine, shall we take a couple of questions before we hand back to you? Is that okay?
Yeah.
So I'll pass on to Andy. Over to you.
Yeah, well, there is a lot to agree with in your book, and I do thank you for the work you've put into it and congratulate you on the publication of it. But I mean, as things are, I just want to sort of air an area of disagreement with your argument, right? Because you talk about dependency theory and modernization. But there's a whole line of critique of modernization which you just drop. And that's a great shame because it's actually a Marxism coming from Latin America. So there is a question of the power relations of epistemology involved here as well. Because, I mean, what Latin American Marxist dependency theory said is it's not uneven development, it's underdevelopment. So global value chains don't just cause uneven development, they underdevelop Latin America. And what's the difference? What's the difference between underdevelopment and undevelopment is two major points. One is that there is a systematic transfer of value, right? So it's not just you've got different capitalisms, you've got it's not just capitalism, it's an imperialist preying on Latin America. And the second point is it's a real shame, because you could have been a bit more generous to Marini, to be honest with you, right? Marini made a massive intellectual breakthrough because what you say is inconsistent. You say that workers are paid less than a living wage. Marx's concept of absolute and relative surplus value do not cover that situation, right? They don't cover it. And Marx is very explicit about that. And Marini extends Marx in a creative way to include that dimension. And the concept of labor superexploitation, which comes from Marxist dependency theory, is a key category theoretically because it anchors what imperialist transfer of value is. So what I think you've done is you're tackling real problems, and I want to be very sort of fair about this. I'm on your side, right? But I think it's slightly milk and water dependency theory, to be honest, right? It's sort of dependency theory for a European audience, right? And it lacks a certain force of argument, which Marini gives it, and I'm just asking myself the question, why, right? Why is that? Why don't you go for underdevelopment and labor super exploitation? What's your problem with it?
Thanks a lot, Andy. I normally don't tend to jump in early in the discussion as the chair, but actually my question would follow up directly to Andy. And you mentioned that every chapter can be read in itself, and that's correct. And in every chapter, you go a lot through the mainstream literature. very well done, very, very correctly criticized, and then it's basically pushed aside because there's a lack of a class analysis, power relations, and all the thing. But I'm just wondering, why is it that, and I'm not just saying that to you, Ben and Christin, but why is it that we as critical Marxist scholars often feel we have to engage so much in detail with the mainstream approaches when perhaps there would have been other Marxist literature which could have been much more useful in developing your argument. So there's the work on super exploitation, Andy Higginbottom, John Smith, they are both in the room. There's a lot of work on unequal exchange, which I think would also be very relevant to develop the argument. There's a lot of Marxist literature on geopolitics and how that can be conceptualized. And so is it perhaps that sometimes the location where we find ourselves within academia seems to impose on us that we constantly engage with the mainstream literature rather than push the boundaries by engaging with other critical approaches? And that doesn't take away anything from your argument. Yeah, but I think that there is, Andy pointed to it, there's a range of relevant Marxist literature, the engagement with which perhaps could have added analytical benefits, depths to the argument. Before I pass over to John, I go back to you, Christine and Ben.
Well, I would suppose that John would maybe point into the same direction, so I wouldn't be against taking John's
Okay,
comment first.
John. Thank you, Christine.
Okay, thank you very much, and I find it a very interesting read as well. And I do feel the same thing. I mean, one of the contributions that the book claims for itself is the concept of immiserating exploitation, which really is just a rename of super exploitation. And there is a lot of literature on the topic of super exploitation. And simply renaming it and then kind of claiming it's an innovation and ignoring the literature on super exploitation seems to me to really sort of reinforce the comments that Andreas and Andy have already mentioned. But so what I would like to just ask though is the idea that you advance and that you talked about in your presentation of international class relations and that being the necessary perspective. I mean, of course, that must be the perspective. You can't understand national class relations, especially in today's world, unless you understand it within an internationalist framework. And I'm just wondering, we need to be more concrete about what we mean by international class relations. We can't just invoke the abstract concept of international class relations without being more concrete about it. One of the things that needs to be really addressed is that one of the most important features of today's world is the violation of the equality between working people on a global scale, the violation of the equality of workers. Marx assumed the equality of workers in his quest for the general theory of capital. He assumed that he assumed an equality between workers based on their free mobility. That free mobility, that equality is fundamentally and systematically violated on a global scale. And unless we understand and place concretely what we mean by the violation of the equality of working people on a global scale, and that necessarily and inevitably leads to a concept of different rates of exploitation. And I don't get from your book an acknowledgement of differential rates of exploitation and how that is fundamental. Just to give you one little example of it, I think the critique of capitalist bourgeois definition of productivity is extremely important. And as you use in your book, we've got little choice but I'll just be very quick on this, and then I'll stop. But in your book, you talk about you use the data on value added per worker divided by wage per worker, which is basically unit labour costs. And the bourgeois approach claims that unit labour costs should be equal across between countries, and clearly it is not. It should be equal between countries if their theory of the marginal productivity of labour being reflected in the wage that the workers received. But actually, from a Marxist point of view, you can see that capitals with high organic composition will attract a greater share of total value in order to equalize the rate of profit between themselves and capitals with lower organic composition. So you would expect, if there was equal rates of exploitation on a global scale, you would expect to see higher productivity in the advanced capitalist countries than in the low wage countries, because the higher organic composition would mean that the amount of value that those capitals attract is proportionate to the total capital that they advance, not just to the capital that they advance in the form of wages. What we actually find is the opposite, where and you quote data in your book on this that shows that the productivity of labour is higher in the low wage countries, which is an indication of exploitation, but actually obscures the real extent of the different rates of exploitation. So already, even in the statistics that you use, you can actually see reflected different rates of exploitation. In other words, the basis of a theory of super exploitation. So I'd just like you to comment on that, because it seems to me I don't really see where you actually take the theory and the understanding of these relations actually forward, rather than just repeating what's already been done.
Okay, so that's a lot of material to engage with. Now over to you, Ben and Christine, and I let you decide who responds to which issue.
You can start, Ben.
Okay. Okay, so I mean, so I'll start with Andreas's point, because I mean, that's fair enough. On the one hand, as Marxists, we like to read about what each other are saying and not to get drawn into endless critiques of the mainstream. But at the same time, you just have to pick up a Marxist journal and you see Marxists getting really angry at each other, more angry with each other than the capitalists, about the different and the misdeployment, as it were, of Marxist concepts and categories. So in a way, we wanted to target the mainstream. That was the logic there. I mean, obviously, I mean, all of Andy, Andreas, and John's points, I mean, it is absolutely correct. The dependency theory, unequal exchange, various strands of Marxism and so on are very rich, and there can be a productive engagement with them. So I take that point. So just to, you know, John, well, I can't remember. One of you said you take Marini's argument about super exploitation and rebrand it as immiserating growth regimes. I don't think that's true, because we show that super exploitation, and so I agree with John and Andy on this. Super exploitation, the payment below subsistence wages, however you want to define it. So, I mean, some people say, oh, how do you define that? Well, there's the anchor methodology that talks about a living wage, and this is very well thought through methodological approach. Mainstream, but it does the job. So you can define it. So super exploitation is a useful concept. Why do we redefine it, as you've put it, or reinvent it as immiserating growth regimes? Because you don't just have super exploitation in the global south, you've got super exploitation in the global north as well. And you have these poverty wages being paid, and they are proliferating in the UK, in Germany, I guess, Christin can say, certainly in the United States. And there are many cases of that. So what does that say? What does this theory of super exploitation and value transfer say about those cases? Yes, super exploitation exists in the global south. Yes, it exists in the global north. And this is why we're talking about capitalist value chains and international class relations, rather than just, and I'm putting that in inverted commas because it's obviously a huge deal, rather than just the transfer of surplus from south to north, which we agree takes place, and we provide a framework for understanding how that takes place. So I don't accept that we've just renamed it for our benefit in that sense. I think we go beyond a kind of structural north-south definition of surplus of exploitation and value transfer, and show how CVCs are raising the rate of exploitation across the globe. And, you know, John talks about how Marx assumes equality of workers. Okay, so at one theoretical level, you can say that, but he also provides huge amount of empirical examples about racism, about the Irish in Britain, for example, about how there are divisions reproduced again and again to maintain capitalist rule, to raise the rate of exploitation, to have differential rates of exploitation throughout. Many examples Marx gives of this type of differentiation, which you would expect as a Marxist, we would all expect, because if that didn't happen, if you did have the unity of the working class, then we would expect capitalism to have been overthrown. Why hasn't it been overthrown? Precisely because of these divisions that are reproduced again and again, and the capitalists know what they're doing there, and it's not just the capitalists that are doing it. You know, that has to be said as well. I think that's those. Christin, you'll come back to these. I think, Andrea, you raised a great point at the beginning. You said we, Christin and I, we've shown how imperialism has manipulated GVCs and generated GVCs, but how, you asked, have the system of GVCs impacted back on or changed the nature of imperialism? I think that's a fantastic question, really important. And so one example is that these core technologies that Christin mentioned, which include now things like iPhones and computers and all of this kind of stuff, they're produced across borders. They are very high tech. Speed, efficiency, all of these things are essential to the competition between different firms producing these goods. And how do they achieve this increased efficiency, increased speed, and so on? By using new minerals, new resources, rare earths, special minerals from across the world. So in a sense, one example is that an old style telephone, the one that you'd pick up and phone like that, you know, that contained maybe 10, 20, 30 elements in the periodic table. Modern smartphones contain something like 2/3 of the periodic table in them. These elements, these minerals are spread across the world. There is an intensification of production in that sense. And and this feeds back into the imperial structure, where the United States in particular cannot allow other countries to have access to and control over those rare earths. So this is a direct consequence of globalization, of CVCs emerging through these core technologies, and the dialectical impact back upon production and imperialism in this way. So I hope that answers your question, Andrea. I think it's a really fascinating question, and I think it is the right question. You know, when you look at a lot of social sciences in the mainstream journals, they seem to be asking the wrong questions. I think this is one of the right questions, and I think it opens up a whole vista for really interesting analysis. I'll hand over to Christin.
Yeah, thanks. So I'll start with Andreas's question, just adding a little bit to what Ben just said. If I understood you correctly, Andrea, you said how have CVCs promoted the search of powers that are now kind of challenging the US? And I think you have to look at this as a historical process, because CVCs were growing in importance after the 70s and especially in the 90s. And one part of the story is that US capitals, but also let's say European capitals, have heavily invested in China. CVCs have been part and parcel of the relation that people like Intensive Funding, for instance, have analyzed, where US capitals have invested in China, exploited cheap labor power, and repatriated the profit to the US. And this has been part of the development of capitalist value chains, where it has been meeting with a situation where the Chinese state, due to many reasons, most of all, obviously, to the revolution in China and the capacity not to be the US backyard, not to be part of that, but also the immense labor power in them countries. And many reasons have led to a situation where China, unlike other states, were able to use the investments made in China to create technological developments themselves. To say you can only invest here if there's some sort of passing away. Sorry, I'm missing some of the necessary English words here. This is a very particular situation where the historical development of CBCs and US investments in China have led to a situation where China could actually use these investments to create a development that has made China able to become a challenger. And I do think that similar processes happen elsewhere, but won't very probably lead to the same situation. For instance, recently a lot of companies have started investing in India, doing part of the job that has previously done in China are being done in India now, and kind of the Indian economy has been growing to a certain degree, but India is not China. India doesn't have a communist party state, which is very much connected to strategic national capitalist development, where I do not think that the same will be happening. But I hope this is at least a part of an answer to your question. Andy and Andreas and John, to be very honest, I have to say I don't think that I can give you a very satisfying answer today. I do agree that the book would have been a lot better if we did take the time to not only criticize the mainstream and present our results as part of this critique, but also to engage much more with Marx's work on geopolitics, Marx's work on development, underdevelopment, as you said, Andy. But in my case, to be really honest, to be able to write a book when I would feel that I could really, in a satisfying manner, do this discussion, I would start writing that book in 5 years. And I hope I will do that to some point, because I really want to write a book about imperialism and the imperialist chain and changes within the imperialist chain, where I do think all these discussions need to be in there. But I will still tell you 2 reasons why we didn't primarily base what we did on Marini's work. I don't have kind of a big problem with the notion of super exploitation. I mean, as you just said, it is a notion that has been previously used by Marx, and it has been developed by Marini. But I do think that in Marini's work, what Marini himself says is that he's kind of moving from circulation to production, from connections to the world market, to their effects on the internal organization of class relations, and then returning to circulation. And I do think that the notion of international class relation is trying to start from the class relations and looking at how they are constituted internationally, both at the national level and at the international level, creating uneven geographies of production that are also leading to underdevelopment, obviously. But I do have the sense that Marini's dependency theory is much less circulationist than, for instance, world systems analysis. But I do have the feeling that I would like to work more through how international class relations kind of create and recreate the core periphery contradiction, rather than the other way around, how core periphery contradiction creates certain class relations in countries like Argentina and other Latin American countries. And I think that this is not a contradiction to saying that I want to explain imperialist appropriation or the payment below subsistence wages in peripheral countries. What I do think, though, is that the notion of super exploitation, at least in the discussion as I know it here, sometimes in Germany, does imply the danger of reifying a certain state of exploitation. Because what I do think is that value, I mean, Marx said that to a certain degree, value and the cost of the subsistence is also part of the class struggle. And I think, I mean, in my working group, for instance, we are actually using the notion of super exploitation, for instance, when we speak about migrant labor in the German meat industry. But what's also happening is that the German capitalists are not only super exploiting migrant workers, but at the same time pushing down the value of the labor power overall. And I think what we need to be doing a little bit more around the notion of super exploitation is to think it historically and dynamically in the sense of where does super exploitation start and where does the capitalist class struggle from above that is kind of pushing down the value of the labor power entirely start. I don't know if I could make my point here, but I would like to think these things through more in the future.
Excellent responses. Many thanks both. More questions, issues, comments, colleagues? Catherine.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentations, and I very much look forward to reading the book. I just wanted to know a bit more if you could expand on the solutions. You were mentioning the docs and the people who got, well, their pay rise. But what else are you expecting? And, well, is that enough to get this 70 pay rise? Because what about the rest of the workers? And, well, yeah, if you could just expand more on what it would look like to have this revolution, because of course we could look at the CSSGJ EU regulations, and that wouldn't be transformative. Okay, now it's been reduced, but before it was more promising. But you seem to be saying no to that, even if it had been more promising. So, what is this revolution? What does it look like? I know it's going a bit beyond the book, but to push you on that.
Thank you, Catherine. Do we have another question which we can add at this stage? I don't see any questions in the chat. Nobody else? Well, then for now, back to you, Christin and Ben.
Maybe I'll go first. So the chapter where we talk about worker structural power is it's got a it is a lead written by Dara Leyden, and he goes into a lot of detail about the idea of social upgrading within global value chains and the limitations of that idea. And then he talks about drawing on various work, including our own, and we worked on this together, about the idea of structural and associational power. And so the example I gave previously about the dock workers in the United States deploying their structural power is important. And there are many other examples: docks, strategic choke points, warehouses. I mean, if you look at the strike, I think it was in 2024 as well, by the big three auto workers, not by the auto workers union in the big three, led by the UAW, led by Sean Fain. They were quite, they recognized that they had structural power. To quote a former executive of Tesla, it takes tens of thousands of components to make a car. It only takes one not to make it. And you just take that one component out of the supply chain and the whole thing grinds to a halt. And so you have many workers' organizations who now understand this and are deploying this to their benefit. But what we also go on to say in the book is that it is not enough for two reasons. One, even when they win, it's still capitalism, still the supply chain, still expanding. But two, and more importantly, in a sense, for the immediate analysis, is that this is not a possibility for all workers. We draw on the work of Jörg Novak, who's Andreas Spieler's colleague, who's done really excellent work on Brazilian truckers' strike. And he shows that, they've got this immense structural power, but that structural power is not enough to win the increases, because you've got a broader political economy. So what he's doing in that work is he's breaking through, or he's rejecting, or he's not even partaking in the kind of methodological singularism or the firm centrism that bedevils so much of the global value chain approach. And he's placing the analysis of a particular value chain of the truckers within a national political economy framework, and we find that very valuable and very useful. And then we go on and give various other examples of class analysis as it's been deployed to show the strengths and limitations of workers' struggles. Ultimately, though, and Christin can speak more to this, we say these struggles are necessary. These struggles are important in terms of differentiating why some workers get paid better wages than other workers within the same supply chain. What is the key variable there? For us, it's balance of class power, class formation, class struggle, not social upgrading per se. But beyond that, I've lost my train of thought now, but I think beyond that, we're also saying it's not enough, because ultimately we need to start thinking beyond these systems of these value chains, which are systems of exploitation. So even if you improve your situation within a context of exploitation, that exploitation will continue and it will inevitably intensify, and the gains that you've made will be worn away after a while, as we've seen across much of the so-called advanced countries following the crises of the 1970s and the onset of so-called neoliberalism. I don't know, Catherine, how that answers your question. If you'd like to come back on that, and then Christin can answer the more difficult parts of your question, perhaps.
How much time do we have left, Andreas? I think we could keep discussing this.
We've got 15 minutes left, so
yeah.
no problem.
Yeah, and Catherine, maybe we can hear your opinion on this too. But I would say I'm really exceeding everything that has to do with the book now. I can't tell you how the revolution will look like. I hope I can be in it and then figure out. But I will tell you this. I do think that thinking about revolution and thinking about revolutionary real politics today is obviously about labor struggles from below. It's about class struggle and about fighting for concrete improvements in the here and now, but in a way that are not compatible, for instance, with the way German unions would work, to create a slight betterment for the white part of the German working class, leaving aside issues around labor exploitation and migration, for instance, that can also lead to a situation where a part of the working class is not really against the system, but rather kind of taken over. What I want to say with this is that the struggles that we fight in the here and now, according to Rosa Luxemburg, need to be fought in a way that it has a cost for capital, and that it creates a better situation for future struggles, which would be connected then to struggles around international solidarity. And I do think that we have to think about capitalist society as a whole, as a social formation, obviously starting from the class relations, but this also has to include political and ideological and cultural forms of capitalist society that includes struggles against racism, struggles against racialized forms of exploitations, and for international solidarity. It has to imply fights against the current gender relations we're facing, and it has to imply fights against, for instance, animal exploitation. That is also part of the capitalist social formation. And here again, if you do that in a way that is not within the borders of capitalist society, and that it does have a cost for capital, for instance, for meat capital, it can't be a fight for animal welfare in the sense that companies can then use it to say, okay, now you have the pigs have a little bit more space and everything can go on even better because the protest is over. It has to be fought in a way, as I said earlier, that kind of creates improves the situation for future struggles. So yeah, to sum up, I would say the last thing I said is true for all the different kinds of struggles, and I think it is necessary to think about this fight as a fight for a new social formation that won't be a capitalist social formation anymore.
Excellent, thank you. Catherine, you're welcome to come back, but it's not a must.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so I know I'm surrounded by Marxists here, and I agree with all you're saying, but I come from the well, critical liberal perspective more, and I was wondering, what do you do with law and regulations? So I think, okay, struggles are fine, and but for me, they only go a certain way given the world we're in. And so if we had laws, if we had like the EU regulations, okay, they failed basically because the big companies won, and we didn't impose it on all SMEs. But what do you think of imposing on all SMEs? You know, you're talking about, okay, basically intersectionality, focusing on racism, focusing on gender, but rules can do that too. And if we had rules in Europe which imposed on European companies to see all those, so okay, so it will only have an impact on European value global chains, but it's a start somewhere. So is there anything you have against rules, or or is it something you would consider, or do you just say no, it's just part of a capitalist system and there's no point in doing that at all, and we just go straight for the struggle? So how does it fit basically?
Can I answer with an example, with a concrete example from my own research and the struggles around it as well? So I'm researching, among other things, labor and migration in the German meat industry, where many people from mostly Eastern European countries are highly exploited, or as John and Andy would now say, super exploited. And there has been a struggle around the labor relations that have led to this form of exploitation. So until a couple of years ago, people earned something like 5 or 6 euros an hour in one of the imperialist centers, I'd say. And then one of the reasons why this could work for the meat industries were because they used subcontractors for the workers, like sometimes even a chain of subcontracting, where a subcontractor hired a subcontractor to hire the workers that would then work at the meat company, at the meat packing company. And then there was a fight for a re-regulation of this. And this fight was successful, and I supported it, and many people from the union supported it, because now in the German meat industry, this form of subcontracting is forbidden. And obviously the labor relation as such, people that work for a meat company now have to be employed directly at this company. And formally now they get the minimum wage. And on this level, the situation is better than it was before. So no, I'm not against rules, I'm not against regulation, and then absolutely not against using these platforms of struggle for our struggle for betterment. But you also have to be aware of what happens with these kinds of regulations in the context of a very particular relationship of power between the classes. Because in the meat industry now, for instance, while migrant workers are formally directly employed and formally get the minimum wage, some of the companies have come up with new ideas of how to get part of that wage redirected to them, for instance, by giving housing that is so expensive that it's not compatible with the normal German housing prices, or by putting former subcontractors that create a notion of fear in the fabric to get people work longer for that minimum wage, and so on and so forth. So yeah, regulation can be used to struggle for change, but regulation is not everything, considering the concrete power relations. And I think that our strategies have to keep that in mind. And this is what I speak about with unionists a lot in the meat industry at the moment, because now, for instance, they tend to leave the meat industry aside and go a step further to the next industry to struggle for a similar regulation, which is fine. But I would say what they should do now is try to organize systematically migrant workers in the meat industry to try to make something out of this regulation first.
Thanks a lot, Christine. Excellent example. We still have time for one further question. while you think about putting one to Christine and Ben, I'd just like to draw your attention to our next seminars organized by the Center for the Study of Social Global Justice. So in 2 weeks' time, Andy Higginbotham will give the next installment of his Capital Volume 3 lecture series, fascinating series, which I can highly recommend. So please do join us in 2 weeks' time. It's always on a Monday at 6 p.m. And in 4 weeks' time, our next seminar will be by Sinem Bal, and she will be talking about women, commons, and ecological resistances in Turkey. Again, it would be great to see some of you at the seminar, and I'm going to put our CSSGJ Eventbrite website into the chat, and when you click on it, you can access all the forthcoming talks and register for a free Zoom ticket. Anyway, while I'm doing that, do we have any further questions, please? Contribution, comments? Catherine,
Okay, a different
you are the
question.
only one who has the final question, then by all means, over to you.
No, well, and Sinem with her next book. No, I was just actually I was marking first year essays, and the question is, what is the gravest problem in international politics? And so they all came up with colonialism and imperialism. So okay, that's a start. But I wanted to know, well, how does actually gender fit also in your book? Because okay, there's all this colonialism, imperialism. Okay, what do you do with gender in the book? Because I think that's an important dimension that we need to have.
I think that's an excellent question to finish off with. So over to you, Ben and Christine, for a final response.
You want to start, Ben?
I mean, yeah, so thanks, Catherine. So we our class analysis is we think about exploitation, surplus value extraction, but we also have an element in there, not enough for Andreas, but I mean, you criticize us for not having enough social reproduction theory, but it is in there. I think I'm pretty sure it's in there, where we talk about how the labor relation is also based upon the reproduction of unpaid labor as a input and as a necessary contributant to the reproduction of the wage labor force. So in that sense, we draw on social reproduction theory to make that basic point. I mean, it doesn't go deeply into it, but that has implications for a lot of analysis in terms, for example, the double burden of both housework and of kind of exploitation in the factory. So it's definitely there. Absolutely, for sure, we could have done a lot more on that, on questions of race and racism and racialization. These elements, again, we were thinking about including more of them, but a book has got when we had our limits with the book, and so we didn't go more into depth there. I think we could have definitely gone more into depth. I mean, in my own work prior to this, I did talk about how in my work on Northeast Brazil, how firms employed women because of their nimble fingers, following Diane Elson. It's as if they read Diane Elson and Ruth Pearson's article from, I think it's 1981, and said, we need to employ women because they've got nimble fingers and they're cheap and so on. We can control them more, boss them around more and so on. But what was interesting was that how, in my work, I showed also how the trade union, which became increasingly led by militant women, won a range of gains for the working class in this part of Northeast Brazil, but specifically for women workers. So a whole range of benefits that didn't exist that would cost the employers more if women workers were to take them up, such as maternity leave and so on. I'm not just saying maternity leave is only for women workers. Obviously, it's for the working class as a whole. But the way the employers saw it was that this would represent a greater cost for them if women workers were to take up this potential maternity leave. And so what I saw there was a changing gender division of labour, where women who were primarily hired became a bit less hired, and more men were integrated into the labour force doing so-called nimble-fingered work, and how women became more casualised and moving from permanent to less permanent, more temporary kind of relations. So in that work previously, I did have a kind of class gender dialectic analysis taking place, and we certainly could have done the same thing with our analysis of labour relations in this book, and so on. But then that would have meant another chapter, I think. Christin, do you want to add?
Yeah, at least another chapter. I mean, I said maybe I feel ready to write a better book on imperialism in 5 to 10 years. I'd say the same about this issue. I mean, I would say what we did is neither intersectional in the sense that all these relations take place on the same analytical level, nor would we say, or at least nor would I say that gender relations could just be derived from class relations or something like that. What I would do in a future analysis would dive more into how patriarchal gender relations that in some forms are pre-existing capitalism have been reshaped and newly shaped through the capitalist relations of production. And I think it is necessary to differentiate between an analysis of capitalism as a mode of production, what Marx did, in order to explain how social wealth is produced and distributed under the conditions of private property of means of production. And then to also analyze how these relations kind of shape gender relations, not only in production, but also in social reproduction. Like, how has capitalist society made benefits from, on the capital side, from massive unpaid labor, both in the households and in capitalist production. So yeah, I do think there's a lot of literature to relate to, a lot of discussion going on, and it would be super interesting to dive into that, and also related to empirical analysis. Again, maybe in the meat industry, where women in the meat industry, for instance, not only do different kinds of work, but sometimes are also paid less, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very good note to end off with our seminar this evening. Many thanks to our audience for your engagement, for your participation, but especially many thanks to our two presenters. And again, congratulations to the publication of your fantastic book.
Thank you.